Hello everyone, and welcome to a special presentation from Florida Gateway College, a conversation with James Montgomery, who is an educator in Columbia County for almost 60 years. Today we're going to talk about Pearl Harbor Day and the start of the U.S. involvement in World War II. James, welcome to the special program.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Now, a lot of people know Pearl Harbor Day is December 7th. Not really celebrated, but we don't have a parade or anything, but it was a day sort of like 9/11.
Right.
Something you always remember. For those who are alive back in the day, remember exactly where they were when Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th.
I was in the third grade.
Third grade.
I remember going to school that day, and there was a lot of excitement going on, but of course I didn't know what it was about, but I was in third grade then.
Now, again, in those days, the communications was not like it is today, where you may have found out a day or two after the fact what exactly had happened. But let's talk first about why this happened. Japan wanted world supremacy, or just supremacy in from the west coast of the United States through Asia?
No, it was the Far East.
Far East.
Eastern Asia is what they wanted. Now they believed that it was their destiny to control Eastern Asia. They felt like that they were from divine origin, okay, that they were divine. Of course, their emperor was divine. They looked upon the emperor as being divine. Now, after the war, we left him in as emperor in order to bring Japan back. But we made him go and explain to the Japanese people he was not divine, okay? But they looked upon him as divine, and they looked upon themselves as have divine origin. And they looked upon the Far East, or Eastern Asia, as simply their destiny to control Eastern Asia, okay? And so it would be a natural thing. About the only country standing in their way for that would be the United States. They didn't fear Europe at all in any way, but the United States, that's different. They took us very seriously.
And for those who are watching this and may not know the history of World War II, back in those days, China was not a major player. So Japan felt like they could even control China as well.
Oh, absolutely. Well, they invaded China in 1937 and took it over, at least along the coastline. They didn't take all of China, but they controlled the coastline. The United States, we go back a long ways with Japan. We actually opened up Japan. Many historians say that we probably should have left Japan, let sleeping dogs lie, as they say, because in 1853, we wanted to trade with Japan, but Japan was a isolationist country, and when I say isolation, I mean isolation. They didn't let anyone come into their country. They didn't let anyone go out of their country. One ship per year could come into their country from the Netherlands. They were isolated, but we wanted to trade with them, and so we sent Matthew Perry over there in 1853 to see if they would trade with us, okay? And they did, and without going into a long story on that, they decided to do just that. Interesting, just a little tidbit, the flag that was on Matthew Perry's flagship was flown on the Missouri when the Japanese signed their surrender.
Wow. So
isn't that interesting?
That is very interesting. Well, I think it's important that people understand the history of Japan, of being an isolationist entity, and the United States did try to trade with them a little bit,
right.
and which
woke them up.
And they became.
Which many historians say we shouldn't have done that, because immediately after that, they jumped on China, and then they jumped on Russia, okay? And then, of course, they jumped on us.
So let's talk about Pearl Harbor and the plans and preparations.
Okay.
Why Pearl Harbor? Why? I know that it was a possession at the time.
Well, it's just a natural thing. If you're going to control the Far East, you've got to have resources, okay? You've got to have the materials. Japan is an island, okay? It doesn't have the resources. And so for a long time, we sold them every bit of scrap iron we had in the United States. And we sold them oil also. But finally, after they had jumped on China, China was a friend of ours. And after they jumped on China, we cut off the oil and we cut off the scrap iron. Now, they've got to find resources. They've got to have resources. And so that's when, of course, they started moving elsewhere in the Far East to control other areas. But they've got to have those. Now, if they're going to do that, the only way we would, of course, negotiate with them to give them the oil back and give them the scrap iron back and that is they got to get out of China, okay? Because China's a friend of ours. We got to get out of China, where they're not going to get out of China, okay?
Well, that's because they had the resources they needed.
Had the resources
in China,
they needed.
and we're probably taking the resources.
And after that, they went in Indochina. To do that, you got to get out of China, you got to get out of Indochina, you know, and of course, they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that.
When we talk about Indochina, we're talking about Vietnam.
Yeah, in that area, right.
Okay.
Right, okay. And so as a result of that, of course, then the United States is the country that stands in their way. Naturally, if you're going to, if you're eventually going to have a war with the United States, where do you hit them? Where it hurts the most. And where's our fleet? In Pearl Harbor.
And the Pacific Fleet is in
Pearl
Harbor.
In Pearl Harbor,
all of them are there.
It is in Pearl Harbor. But of course, we did not, even right up to the very day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we did not believe it would be Pearl Harbor. I mean, that's 4,000 miles away from Japan. A fleet getting that far away from its base, you don't do that, okay?
Well, you at least would know if they were coming.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, but so they had to start planning for it. Actually, the story is that the final exam at the Japanese Naval Academy every year was, if you were to attack Pearl Harbor, how would you do it?
Really?
How would you do it? And actually, the plan they used was a plan that one of our admirals came up with. You know, you know how we do. We will go through dry runs and see if we're going to be attacked. Here's how you do it. You know, and they read that and said, that's pretty good. But the thing that they have to start doing, have to start planning. Pearl Harbor is going to be their target. We could not believe. We thought, well, maybe the Philippines, but not Pearl Harbor. That's too far away, way too far away.
Now you're talking when you talk about too far away, getting that amount of
that fleet,
planes
that far away from their base. Okay, that's 4,000 miles. Okay, you don't do that. But anyway, so the plan was handed over to Admiral Yamamoto, and he would be in charge of it. He, of course, is given the credit for being he was the admiral in charge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he is given the credit to saying, of course, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, well, all we've done today is to awaken a sleeping giant. Very famous saying. All we've done today is to awaken a sleeping giant, which is true. But he is the one in charge of the plan. And a lot of planning has to go into this. Number one, how do you get to Pearl Harbor? You can't go the straight line to Pearl Harbor. You cross too many sea lanes. People will see you. A big fleet like this, you know, they know you're coming. So they came up with a plan that the American admiral came up with, and that was stay north, stay just below the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, see? Head east by going north of Midway and all those islands up there. Nobody's up there. The whole way from Japan to Pearl Harbor, they ran into one ship, and that was a Japanese ship. And so first was the route. How are you going to go? You stay up north. That's where it's going to be stormy this time of year anyway, so you're not going to have much traffic up that way. So that's the first thing to do, okay? That's the first planning. Second planning is you've got problems in Pearl Harbor, okay? You've got to plan for Pearl Harbor. You've got to practice that. One problem they had was in relation to the torpedoes. Of course, they're going to be hit with carriers, okay? It's a plane that's going to be hitting Pearl Harbor. And they're going to, the torpedoes that they had dove too low, and it would go into the bottom of Pearl Harbor, okay? So they had to come up with a torpedo that would stay higher up. Second thing, I didn't realize this, but a torpedo, it arms itself while it's in the water going toward the ship. And so it has to have time to arm. So they had to come up with a way of arming the ship, okay, arming the torpedo. So that had to be worked out. And then another problem they had with Pearl Harbor is we had one ship and another ship side by side, okay? Well, you can hit the first one with a torpedo, but not the second one, okay? Not the second one. And so not only do they have to have the torpedoes, okay, but they've got to have dive bombers too, in order to hit the second ship, be able to hit the second ship. So a lot of planning, once you get there was a lot of planning that had to be done when you got to Pearl Harbor. What a lot of people don't realize is that the attack on Pearl Harbor was in two phases, planes and submarines. They had submarines.
Because they wanted to get the ships as they were leaving.
They had submarines there too. And you had the two things at Pearl Harbor at the time. But there's a lot of planning went into it. And Yamamoto, he was in charge of all of that planning, which they had to be done. But it is recorded that by the time all the training was done of those pilots in Japan getting ready for that those were probably the best trained pilots in the world. I mean, they practiced and practiced. They had a place on one of their islands that was very much like Pearl Harbor. And they practiced and practiced and practiced. And it was considered they were probably the best pilots in the world at that time.
Let's talk about the approaching war. The Germans were at war. They were taking over countries in Europe. And talk about how this fits into the Second World War.
Well, okay. Our war is the Pacific. In Europe, of course, you've got France, you've got Britain, you've got Russia, and you've got the United States. In the Pacific, that's our war. That's our war. The original plan, which is interesting when you think about it, the original plan, of course, for the Second World War was take care of Europe first. Europe first. Then take care of the Pacific. In other words, kind of like if you were going to fight two people. You fight the one, the tough one, you see, and then you hold the second one off with the other arm, kind of hold him back, okay? That was the strategy for the war. Take care of Hitler first, then go after Japan. Go after Japan after that. Interestingly enough, and of course Douglas MacArthur got very upset over that strategy because he felt like he was getting kind of the leftovers, which in many ways he was. He was kind of getting the leftovers. But yet, interestingly enough, both of them ended pretty much the same time. Even though we weren't planning on that, we really were fighting two wars at the same time. But the Pacific War was our war. That was ours, no one else, okay?
Let's talk about, you had written in your notes, Tora, 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 the very famous movie from the late or early 70s that was close to as accurate as you could get about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Right. If you haven't seen Tora, T-O-R-A, Tora, that movie, that is probably the most accurate description of all what happened as far as the movie. You ought to take time to watch that. Tora was the signal from the lead pilot back to the carrier that everything's fine, that it is a surprise. Because they really didn't know whether this was going to be a surprise or not. But when he said, Tora, that meant the United States is not ready. It is a surprise, okay? And there was an article just the other day of the woman, it's an actually famous incident where this woman was up in her Piper Cub, flying around, and then all of a sudden here comes all these Japanese planes coming in, flying by her and waving at her and such as this. What in the world going on?
Yeah.
But what?
It was a surprise.
It was a surprise. It caught completely by surprise. And that's why a lot of time we knew by December 7th, we knew they were going to attack us, but we did not know where. We still had that feeling, no way is it going to be Pearl Harbor.
Now, why did they not think Pearl Harbor was it because of the distance?
The distance. There's no way you're going to get 4,000 miles away from your home base, okay, with a ship. And so as a result, it could not be Pearl Harbor. They really thought it was going to be Philippines. It was going to be the Philippines. But we knew by that time, we had broken their code. We'd broken their code. We knew exactly what they were sending messages, to their. We were reading them before their ambassador in the United States were reading them, okay? But we did not think it could be Pearl Harbor. Not until Sunday morning did we know it was going to be Pearl Harbor. Now, that Sunday morning, we knew it was going to be Pearl Harbor, all right? But we couldn't get the message. This is another interesting thing. Everything kind of worked against us at Pearl Harbor. We could not get the message to Pearl Harbor in time to let Pearl Harbor prepare for it. If we could have, they could have been prepared. But sunspots, storms on the sun, what does that do to communication here on Earth? It messes up communication. It just so happened that the communication between the United States and Pearl Harbor was all messed up because of sunspots. We could not get the message to Pearl Harbor. The message finally got to them after the attack was already underway. Now, that is why there's always this conspiracy theory, that this was a setup, that Pearl Harbor was a setup, that Roosevelt planned this to get us into the war. That is true. We needed to get into the war. But the American people did not want in the war. We needed to get in the war because the Battle of Britain is going on. And if Britain collapses, and see, Hitler's already overrun all of Europe except for Britain. Now, and he's bombing Britain right now. And if Britain collapses, it's the world against us. It's the world against us. And we had to get into that war. But as you remember, Germany would not let us into the war. They wouldn't let us into the war. And they learned from the First World War that we talked about the other day.
Right, during the armistice talk.
They started sinking our ships, thinking that we couldn't get in time. Well, we did, and that was the decision on the First World War. So Hitler told them, man, if you see an American ship, you go the other way. Do not mess with American ships. So anyway, Roosevelt, actually the saying is that someone at one of the cabinet meetings say, how can we get Japan to fire the first shot? If you go back through American history, we don't mind getting into a war, but what?
We need to be
provoked.
provoked.
Like the other fella started.
To provoke it.
We want the other fella to start it. Then we can say, want to fight, huh? Okay. So Roosevelt and his administration we had to get in that war. And that's why, of course, that conspiracy that it was a setup. No, I can't believe that.
So you believe that the lack of communication, and they had to use cables?
Well, I don't know what type. I'm not from communication. They had to use a common, slow way of getting the message out there. They could not get the message there in time for it to take place.
So Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, everybody's sleeping in Pearl Harbor. Some people are on alert. Radar people are on alert, and then it all comes.
This is what is scary today to me in relation to atomic wars. Okay, we had warnings. We had warnings ahead of time. There were some real human errors, and that's what scares me today. There were some human errors there. Number one human error. The officer who was in charge of the Air Force, he said, he was afraid of sabotage. These Japanese Americans who were at Pearl Harbor, they're liable to sabotage our planes. All right, so what we need to do is get them all together. So he pulled all our planes from all around Hawaiian Island into one area right there at Pearl Harbor, lined them up. That way we could protect them better. Well, needless to say,
we couldn't get out.
The attack,
we couldn't get out.
Boom! We lost 80% of our planes. I mean, it was just one after another. All the planes were right there together. Second thing, radar was just coming in. Britain was just getting radar. Okay, that helped her with the Battle of Britain. Radar was coming in then, so they could pick up the German planes coming across the canal. We had one radar unit set up and had it manned. And the people were looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, there are planes coming in. They saw it on the radar before the Japanese planes got it. Oh, the plane's coming in. So they called down to headquarters and said, we're picking up planes coming in. Well, headquarters said, well, no, well, there might be some of those planes, our carriers are out. Maybe some of our planes coming in. Or there's some B-17s supposed to come in from the United States. I bet that's what it is.
So they speculated.
Did not do anything about it, okay? And they had picked them up long before they arrived in Pearl Harbor. Another thing, there was a plane flying over. There was a ship out dragging a target that they were doing some practice out in the ocean, target practice. And it was coming into Pearl Harbor. And a plane was flying over and looked down and dadgum, there's a submarine. There's a midget sub in between the ship and the target. So he called it in. Said, there's a sub down there, okay, coming in with them. And whoever they called into said, verify that, okay? Nothing was done about it. And here these Japanese subs coming into Pearl Harbor, no one paid any attention to it.
So there were a bunch of human error.
There were human errors, and this, like I say, this is what scares me. Those men sitting there looking at those monitors, looking for those missiles coming over toward the United States, what would they think? Oh, I wonder what that is,
I think there's a naivete back in the day. No one believed that anybody was going to cause us harm. Today, I think we're more skeptical in the United States about things like that. But when you think about 1941, times were different. Definitely, times were different. Now, everybody remembers the World or a Day of Infamy speech that Roosevelt did on the radio.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Again, there was not TV back in those days. Talk about the result of Pearl Harbor, and Roosevelt finally did convince the Congress to go to war.
Oh, yeah. Of course, the Constitution says that Congress declares war. All right, Congress declares war. And so he had to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. And he said, yesterday, December the 7th, a day that shall live in infamy. Okay. Actually, that's an interesting thing, too. He put the infamy there on the way to Congress. In the original speech he had, because it shows where he scratched it out, a day that shall live in history. All right, now think about it a second.
Infamy is much stronger.
Would that be remembered today? It probably would not be remembered today. He changed it to a day that shall live in infamy. And because he put that word, probably is why we remember it today instead of just a day that shall live in history.
Well, and it was a stronger, when you hear infamy, that really catches people's attention that this was barbaric. I mean, we lost, 4,000 people at Pearl Harbor?
Almost 4,000, about 3,600, yeah. And half of those were on the Missouri. Not the Missouri, the
Alabama,
Arizona.
Which, and again, if you go to Hawaii, the Arizona Museum is still there, and you can see it's very.
And they never took the bodies out of it.
Really, it's really a moving tribute to the sailors that died on that. Let's talk about us getting into the war. This got us going, and I think when you said it awoken a sleeping giant, you had kids in their teens that were trying to sign up to go fight this war. I mean, again, we didn't. There were no videos back then. I mean, there was film of what was going on, but you had to imagine in your mind's eye what happened and how bad it was. And I think that got that sleeping giant to wake up.
Right. It's you can look at, if you put aside the total death of Americans, it was kind of a blessing in disguise, Pearl Harbor, because it woke us up. It woke us up. Prior to that time, there was a tremendous movement in the United States at that time not to get into this war. Lindbergh was one of the leaders of it. Who, of course, flew across the Atlantic first, Charles Lindbergh. Oh, that's an interesting story, too. Charles Lindbergh, of course, the pilot, famous pilot who flew to Paris, after we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, on the way back, that plane got into trouble and had to land in Okinawa. It was not supposed to land in Okinawa, but it had to make an emergency landing in Okinawa, okay? And it came in and landed there, and of course they didn't. Where y'all come from? You know. Guess who the officer was who came on that plane to say, "Who are y'all and where y'all been?"
I don't.
Charles Lindbergh.
Was it really?
Charles Lindbergh, and which is interesting. That's a perfect example. Prior to the war, he was the leader of, we don't want to be in this war, okay? But once Pearl Harbor happened, that's all over. That's all over. Everyone wants to be in.
Well, and for those who don't know, the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war.
Ended it.
And hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians were killed during those two bombs. But I think, your thought is if they didn't do it, more death would have been caused if the war had continued.
Truman, we still argue this today. There's still arguments today on should we have or shouldn't we have, and there's some very famous people who say we should never have dropped it, that we should, that Japan was ready to surrender anyway, all right, which most can show that they were not ready to surrender, all right, they were not ready to surrender.
Well, they were told stories that the Americans were going to have their way with the women. There were always stories that, and so they were going to fight to the end.
Oh yeah, they were going to fight to the end. And we knew from Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Saipan and all those islands, there was a terrible loss of life. And Truman, to this day, would say when they hit him and said, why'd you do that? He said, listen, here's the one. I could not look at that mother in the face and tell her, your son did not have to die invading Japan. I could have ended that war earlier. He said, I could not have looked at that mother and said, your son didn't have to die. But I did not drop the bomb. And so to Truman, there was no choice. There was no choice. That bomb was going to be dropped. And we dropped, of course, the one on Hiroshima, and just a few days later, the one on Nagasaki. But that brought the end into the war at that time. But it would have been a terrible loss of life because they were going to fight to the end. And it was a real fight at the end. After Nagasaki, Hirohito, Emperor Hirohito, he was ready to surrender. He was ready to surrender. But the military was not. And they actually attempted an assassination on Hirohito, the emperor, so they would stay in the war.
Well, James, thank you so much for sharing the Pearl Harbor Day, and it'll be happening next week. And we appreciate the historical perspective of Pearl Harbor Day and the beginning of World War II for the United States of America back in 1941. And we thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to the address on the screen. Until our next chat with Mr. Mont, so long, everyone.